Welcome to this module. In this module, it's finally time to connect our backend to a real database. For this purpose, we will use MongoDB and Mongoose to manage this connection between our backend and MongoDB. And before we continue, make sure to dive into the refresher module, also part of this course, in case MongoDB and Mongoose are totally new to you. If you know the basics of these tools already, then you can continue, and in this module, we'll then have a look at how we can define our Mongoose models. Because Mongoose is all about models, this means we will have to create a place model and a user model. Both models will define the general structure of the so-called documents stored in our MongoDB database. Besides that, we'll also have a look at CRUD operations for our places and our users. CRUD stands for create, read, update, and delete, and these are typical operations you have to do if you want to interact with a database. Finally, we'll also have a look at the relation between places and users. We will establish a connection between these two, because if we, for example, create a new place, then this place should be allocated to a specific user. This logic is missing so far, therefore it's time to implement it. And with that, let's dive into this module. So let's create the place model now. Well, before we do that, what is the place model actually? Well, MongoDB thinks in database, collections, and documents logic. This means we have a database which can contain one or multiple collections, and a collection can contain one or multiple documents. And in our case, each single document is a new place that we stored. That's the MongoDB side. From a Mongoose side, we think in schema and model logic. A schema is the blueprint of a document that we want to store. So in our case, the blueprint of a place. For example, we can make sure that a place must contain a title. So this is the blueprint, the schema. Based on the schema, we create the so-called model. And each instance of this model in our code will then result in a new document. So that's what we want to achieve right here. We want to create the schema and the model. And in the next lecture, we want to instantiate the model to make sure that we can store a new document or a new place in our project. Let's get started with the place schema therefore. For this, I'll go to the models folder, create a new file named place.js. Now the schema and the Mongoose model are concepts related to Mongoose. Therefore, we have to import Mongoose first. So we require Mongoose here. And the schema is also a special concept part of Mongoose. Therefore, we have to create a schema constant here, which accesses the schema method. Now we can create another constant. This will now be our actual schema, and we could call it place schema, as this is the specific schema for a single place. Here we now instantiate our schema and create a new JavaScript object. And this object now contains the logic for our blueprint of a later document. We have such a blueprint already actually as dummy code though, here in our places controllers file. Dummy places also has the general idea behind a document. We, for example, don't need this ID property anymore because the ID will be created automatically by MongoDB when we store a document. We'll see that later. But title, description, location, and so on, these are properties that we want to have in our document and therefore also in our schema. Let's start with the title and add the semicolon here. And we could say that the title should just be a string. That would be possible, but here I would rather add an object because I want to add more information to that title. Because as I said, the title should be of type string, but the title should also be required. This means the title must not be empty. And I guess this makes sense because a place without a title, well, not too helpful. Therefore, we should set required here to true. We can actually copy this because we might need that more often here. The second property is our description. The description, well, should also be a string and is required. Now I want to add a new property we didn't have so far in our places controller, and this is the image. Now one important note here. The image is not the actual file. When we work with databases, the image always is a URL, so a URL pointing towards a file which is not stored in our database, because storing files or images in a database is not a good idea, because it kind of contradicts the idea of a database which should be fast and which should be able to execute the queries as quick as possible. If you imagine storing big files there, well, this would slow down your database, and this is definitely not what you want. Therefore, here we will use a URL. The URL will also be a string and will be required, so we can again use the same logic. We also need an address. The address, well, should also be a string and required. Let's get rid of these double empty spaces here. And then we also need the location. The location is a bit different because in contrast to our previous properties, we now have a nested object, because here in our places controller, you can see that the location contains the lat and long properties. Now, Mongoose is able to interpret that, so we can easily also add a nested object here and now add the latitude, which here should not be of type string, but of type number, and required should again be true. Can actually copy paste this and also do the same thing for the longitude. So here we can also use this nested object logic. The last thing we need is our creator here. The creator will again be of type string and will be required. Don't need the comma here. And the creator later will be replaced by a real unique ID. I mentioned that with the places already, that the ID will be created automatically by MongoDB. Same thing will happen later when we create a new user. For the moment, we'll just use dummy information, so we enter the user ID manually. And with that, we actually created our schema already. This was only step one though. As I said, we have the schema, then we need the model, and then each instance of the model will create the document. So to create this model, we now simply add module exports, and this should be equal to our Mongoose and now the model method. That's a special method available here in Mongoose, and model will return a constructor function later. We have to add two arguments to this function. The first argument is the name of the model. The convention here is to use an uppercase starting character and a singular form, no plural form. Well, as our model is here to create a new place, place is actually a fitting name, I guess. By the way, this will also be the name of our later collection. The collection will not have the uppercase starting character, and it will be plural though. So our collection will be named places then. The second argument is our schema that we want to refer to in our model, and that's our place schema right here. With that, we created our Mongoose schema and the corresponding model. Now it's time to use this model and to create our first document. So where do we create this document? Well, if you think about the operations that we want to achieve here, create, read, update, and delete, then the first logical step to use the model is C, create, because if we can create a document, then we can also have a look at reading it, updating it, or deleting it. So we want to create a new place, and this can of course be done here in our places controller. Here we have the dummy places. We won't use these at the end of this module, of course. And if we go down a bit, we have our create place constant. This is what we should focus on now. As we want to use our newly created place model though, we first have to import it. For that, up here, we import place, again with a capital P, as this will be a constructor function. And this requires our models places file. With that, we can use the place model, and if we go down a bit here it is, our created place constant. The previous code is fine, so here we have some validation, and here we have the coordinates that we get with our geocoding logic, so we don't have to change this. But here, our created place logic, this has to be updated. So let's get rid of this code here, and let's first instantiate our place constructor here with new place. And now we have a new JavaScript object, and here we can now add data to our model. What our model needs though is already predefined by our schema, so we have title, description, image, and so on. Because of that, we can get started with the title once again. I'll again use this shorter syntax here, so title is what I wrote right here. We need the description, the address, we need the location with the corresponding coordinates. and we need an image. And as I said before, the image should be a URL, so no real file. Later in this course, in the file upload module, we'll learn how we can store images on our server, not on the MongoDB server, so not in the database, but on our backend server. Then this URL will point towards a file stored on our server. Here, I'll just take a dummy URL from a file in the internet. Make sure to store this as a string. Don't forget the comma. And with that, we only need our creator here. As I said, we will use a dummy ID here. Don't forget to add the semicolon. And with that, we created our model already. As I said, very important, make sure that the properties here in our model are the same that we have here in our schema. Otherwise, well, this will throw an error. Now, talking about errors, this brings us to this push logic here. This is not valid anymore because we have a different method we can use here for our created place constant now with the model logic, with our place model. The logic here is created place.save. .save is a method available in Mongoose, and save will handle all the MongoDB code you need to store a new document in your database, in your collection. And additionally, save will also create that unique places ID I talked about previously. Save is also a promise. This means we have an asynchronous task. Again, as we saw it with the connect method before, saving files to our database can take a few moments. Therefore, asynchronous task right here. And as we already have async up here in our create place constant, we can now add a wait here. And to make sure we catch any errors, let's also add try catch to make sure we are covered in case anything goes wrong, which hopefully won't be the case. So we will catch our error here and create a new error constant with our new HTTP error we used already. And the error message could be something like creating place failed, please try again. And an error code of 500 here. With that, we are almost done. There is one thing missing though, and this is return next error. We have to add this here, or we should add this here, to stop our code execution in case we have an error. If we don't add return next here, the code execution would continue even if we throw an error. Definitely not what we want right here, therefore important to add this too. With that, we are actually done. So if we now start our server once again and go to Postman, create a new request. This should be a post request targeting HTTP localhost 5000/API/places as we want to create a new place. Then we go to body, raw, and JSON. And now we have to add all the properties that we defined in our model. So this was first the title, which is the Empire State Building, maybe a description, a very famous building in New York. We need the address, which we can again get via Google Maps here. We don't need the location, it's automatically retrieved via our geocoding logic. Same thing is true for the image, we hard-coded that when we instantiate the place. This means we only need to add our creator, and this could be you too maybe. So let's see if we now hit send here. Yeah, this looks good. So we created that place apparently. Here you can see the unique ID that was created automatically. We have an underscore in front of the ID. We'll tackle that later, but generally this looks fine. Let's also see what happens if we go to our database now. Here, if we click onto collections, that looks good. By the way, here we have two places. The first places is the database name. The second is the name of the collection. So places here is what we specified in app.js, right here in the connect method places. And the collection name is here in place.js, right here, our place in the model method without the capital P and in plural. So that's basically the name of this collection here. And more importantly, inside this collection, we can now find one document. And if you look at the ending of the ID, it's EB6, and that's exactly the document we created right here. With that, we achieved a lot already. We were able to create the schema, to create the model, and to create our document in our database. So C, create from our CRUD operations is completed. Let's now continue with the R, read. So we'll have a look at our GET requests now. So creating places works fine. The next logical step in our CRUD operations flow is read, therefore. And to read data, we should focus on to our get places by user ID and get place by ID constants. Get place by ID would mean that we want to identify a place based on this underscore ID right here, so the place specific ID. Get place by user ID would be this creator ID that we manually entered. Let's first focus on to get place by ID though. Here we can keep our first place ID constant. We'll still need this constant to extract the data from our request. But here, our place constant, this is the one that we have to change here. Here, we don't need the arrow function, so we can just delete this entire code here. Because here, I again want to use our place model now. And as I this time want to find existing places, I won't use save as we did it before with our create place logic. Now I will use another method, which is part of Mongoose, and this is find by ID. And by the way, find by ID is a static method here. This means it's not used on the instance of place, but directly on the place constructor function. Find by ID works a bit different though when comparing it to the save method. In contrast to save, find by ID does not return a promise. And still, then catch or async await would be available. That's Mongoose specific though, but from a conceptual perspective, find by ID doesn't return a promise. In case you need a real promise here, not needed here in our case though, you can still get this if you call exec here after find by ID. With that, you could get a real promise. As I said, for our cases, we don't need that as we can still use async await here due to this Mongoose specific feature of find by ID, but it doesn't return a real promise here. However, we can use find by ID now, and we need one argument though, and that's of course our place ID that we previously defined up here. There is one thing missing though. Do you know what? Well, we again have an asynchronous task right here. As for save, also finding an ID is a task which can take a few moments. Therefore, we will again use our async await syntax right here. So we'll add async here and await right there. And as we also did it for our save method, try catch won't hurt here. So let's also add try right here and put our code into our try code block. And we'll of course also catch the error again as we did it before with our error constant and a new HTTP error. And this could say now something went wrong. Could not find a place. And the error code could be 500 right here. So that's our try catch block. Very important though, also as we did it before, we have to make sure that we really stop our code execution in case we have such an error. Therefore, we return next error. Once again, it's the same logic we actually had with our storing places method previously. We have to change one additional thing though. As you can see, place right here is no longer used, although we use it down here in our if statement. The problem here is our block scoping, so we define our constant here inside our try block. Therefore, we have to define place outside of our try block, and we'll also turn const into let here. So let place, and now inside our block, we get rid of the constant. With that, this code works fine again. One important note though, and I got a typo right here. This should not be wrong. This should be wrong, of course. Now it's fine. So one important note, the error catching right here and right there is a different one, and we have to adjust this if statement, by the way. We'll do that in a few seconds. This error is displayed if our GET request generally has some kind of a problem, if we have missing information, for example. In case the request is fine, but we just don't have our places ID in our database, then this second error down here should be thrown. That's the difference between these two errors. Talking about this if statement, to be in line with our previous logic to catch errors when we worked on our create places code, we can again use the logic we had above. So we can simply create a new constant, which is equal to the new HTTP error here. And the statement is fine. But what we need here is we need to return our next error here to make sure our code execution is stopped in case of this error. With that, the code up here works fine. We just have to tweak our response a bit, because there are actually two things that I would like to change here. The first thing is the fact that the object here we are working with, so our place, is a specific Mongoose object in the end. So we have a lot of special Mongoose methods available for this object. Now, whilst this is fine for creating data and for working with Mongoose, when we get back the response, the object might be easier to use if we just turn it into a normal JavaScript object. That's the first thing I would like to do. The second thing is, you remember this ID we have, this underscore ID. I would also like to get rid of this underscore, because although it's not a big problem in general, it's easier to really have clean properties here. So ID without the underscore, this will also make it easier to refer to this ID later. So these are the two things I want to do right here. First, let's turn our place object into a normal JavaScript object. For this, we simply add the toObject method here to the object. With that, the conversion is done already. And our second goal, to get rid of this underscore, well, this can simply be done by setting getters right here to true. And why is getters true doing this? Well, because Mongoose adds an ID getter to every document which returns the ID as a string. Normally, such getters are lost when we call toObject, but with getters true, we can avoid this and tell Mongoose to add an ID property to the created object. That's it actually. With that, our code should be working fine. Let's save our progress. And let's now go to Postman. Now create a new request, this time a GET request. Again, to localhost 5000 right here, /places, and now / the places ID we have right here. So let's enter this ID in the URL. And now let's send this request and see what happens. So this seems to work. We still have our ID up here though with the underscore, but down there we get back the ID without the underscore. With that, we make sure that our get place by ID logic works fine. And now it's your turn, because down here we have our get places by user ID constant. We also have to adjust this one, and the logic is pretty similar to the one that we had before for our get place by ID logic. There is one thing you have to know though, you shouldn't use find by ID here, but the find method. It's a bit more tricky therefore, as you have to make sure that you find a specific property within a place. So basically the ID of the creator. That's the hint I want to give you. So with that, now is your chance to give it a try. And in the next lecture, we'll solve this together. So how did it go? Were you successful? Let me show you my approach now. For that, we have to go down to our get places by user ID constant. Again, user ID is fine right here, but our dummy places, this is what we have to work on. And we'll also have a look at the if code. Let's see if we change this too, but this is actually what we should focus on now. So therefore, let's get rid of this code here. And now we can again refer to our place model here. And this time we will not use the find by ID method up here, as I said, but we'll use a different method, the find method. Find generally works similar as find by ID. This means we again do not return a promise here, but you can again use exec if you want to. But again, find still allows us to use async await here or then catch. Again, this is a Mongoose specific feature available right here. It's not a real promise, but you can use this asynchronous operations here. Find has some other important things to keep in mind though. Generally, using find like this would return all places. This means if we want to have a specific place, in our place a specific place by the user ID, we have to add the user ID here as an argument. So in our case, we can use the creator property and refer to user ID as we define it right here in our constant. That's one thing we have to keep in mind. Another thing is that find is available in both MongoDB and Mongoose, which we're using right here. In MongoDB, find returns a so-called cursor. A cursor simply points towards the results of our find method here of the query we did, and it then allows you to iterate through the different results you would have. The reason for that is that if you would imagine you would have hundreds of places in here, so hundreds of documents, it would avoid to bloat your data immediately and to return big amounts of data. So that's the way how MongoDB approaches this. So you get back a cursor and then can iterate through the different results. In Mongoose, find doesn't provide a cursor, but directly an array. We could also get a cursor in Mongoose, by the way. To do so, we could use the cursor property on our find method, instead of only using just find. That's what you have to keep in mind here. So we're using the Mongoose find method. We are now adding the creator property, and therefore we can filter for the specific document where the creator has the user ID we are looking for in our GET request. This means we can now again add our try catch code block here, put the constant into it. With that, our constant is not available anymore due to block scoping. Therefore, we can create let places outside of our try block and get rid of the constant, and also make sure that this again becomes an asynchronous task. Again, we have a find operation. Therefore, we'll add async up here and await front of our place model. And we also catch our error again with the same logic we had before. Let's again use the constant, which should be a new HTTP error here. And let's say that this should return fetching places failed. Please try again later. And again, that's the logic we have in the 500 error case, so in case anything goes wrong with the request in general. And here we also have to add return next again. With that, this should work fine. Down here, this code could also be refactored, so this way, so that we store the error in a constant. But to show you both ways again, let's this time keep it this way. As I said, you can adjust this to be in line with the rest of the code, but just for demonstration purposes as part of this course, I will just keep this the way it is. But down here, our response has to be adjusted once again. There is a little thing that you have to keep in mind. This was a bit more tricky, I must say, but maybe you did it. In case you have problems, we'll solve it together now. Because again, we have to add a method to our places here, but this time we cannot use our toObject method up here, because the problem is that, as I said, find returns an array right here, and we cannot use toObject with an array. Therefore, we have to use map here, a standard JavaScript method. And with map now being in place, we can again use place toObject right here, and then apply our getters feature to make sure that the underscore from our ID property is removed. So getters is again set to true. And with that, if we now go back to Postman and create a new GET request here, again to HTTP localhost 5000. But this time we have to go to our user's routes. So we go to API/places/user/ and now u2, so the ID of our user right here. Let's add this. Let's press send. Yeah, this looks fine. We get back our response. We again get the ID without the underscore, so getters also works fine. And again, if I would now use, let's say, u3 right here, click send, you see we could not find places for the provided user ID. So this is this error right here, which is also working fine. And with that, we finished R, so read, in our CRUD feature chain right here. Let's now continue with updating places. Time to update our places now. And the great thing now is that we actually learned all the core concepts we need to do so. Therefore, this should be an easy task now. Let's do it together though. So, update places, as before, our first code here with our error check can be kept. This is fine. The same thing is true for the properties here that we want to get from our request body. This is fine. Params can also be kept. But this part here with dummy places, this has to be replaced now as we have real data in our database now. The update logic right here, well, we'll have a look at that in a few seconds. And what I can also see right here is this dummy place should, of course, also be deleted now. So how do we start? Well, in the end, updating a place simply means that we want to get the place by the place ID and then update the title and the description. Now, as I'm talking about finding the place by the place ID, we can again use our find by ID method we had up here for the get place ID constant. This also means that we will use the same try catch block again. Therefore, we can from the start use the same logic in the end we had right here. So we will implement the try catch block from the beginning now though. So let's go down and let's now say that we again have our place variable here, let this time, not a const, as we start with our try catch block. Inside try, we have our place once again, which we use right here, which we just defined. And place should be equal to place dot find by ID. That's the same logic we just saw. And what's the ID that we want to find? Well, that's of course our place ID here. This one. Updating places, once again, is an asynchronous task. Therefore, don't forget to add async up here and await down there. With that, we have to catch any error case here. If we have an error, let's again store it in a constant here. Should be equal to the new HTTP error. And this should state something went wrong. Could not update place. Error code would again be 500. And we should not forget to add return next error here. So this looks fine already. With that, we have to change updated place to place down here as we refer to place up here. Therefore, we can also use place when it comes to updating the title and the description. And what is missing now? Well, storing the updated place, of course. At the moment, we're just sending back a response, which we also have to adjust. But we also have to make sure that the updated information is stored again in our database. For that, we can again use the save method, which we also used before when we created the place. And as we know, save is an asynchronous task. Therefore, we will again use try catch. And now await our place save method to save this updated place. And in case we have an error, we'll again catch it. You see, it's kind of the same process we have here for all these tasks. And here we can say something went wrong. Could not update place. And again, a 500 error code. And also don't forget to return next error down here to make sure the code execution is interrupted. What's missing here? Well, we should again convert our Mongoose object to a normal JavaScript object, and we should get rid of our underscore ID, so of the underscore of the ID property to be more precise right here. For that, we will refer to place dot to object. Here we can use this method directly as we are not having an array here as we had it before when we were getting the place by the user ID. And now we can set getters to true. Let's save this. And let's now see what happens if I want to update the place. For that, I'll create a new request right here. This time it will be a patch request to HTTP localhost, not user, but places / the ID of our place. So let's take the ID down here and let's paste it. Now we need to go to body, raw, and JSON once again. And now we have to add the title and the description that we want to change. For that, let's say the title should be the Empire State Building. Before we had Empire State Building. And the description here should be, well, what do we have at the moment? Here we have a very famous building. Let's say a great building, like this. So we have the two properties. So if we send the patch request now, we can see that it was successful, and we have the title, the Empire State Building, and the description was also changed to a great building. So this also works fine now. Let's now also have a look at our database. And as you can see, we also have the Empire State Building and a great building. So our database was also updated successfully. With that, we have create, read, update. What's missing now is deleting documents in our database. So let's now delete the place. The great thing is that we can apply all the previously learned knowledge here, because in the end, deleting a place simply means to find a place by a specific ID and then to delete it. That's the main thing we have to do right here. For that, here in our delete place constant, we can get rid of all our dummy code that we have in here. And let's now again create let place, because it will be the same logic we had before. We need a try catch block once again, and inside this try catch block we need to find our place. So place should again be equal to place dot find by ID, because again the place ID is what we are looking for right here. So let's add place ID, and once again finding the place is of course an asynchronous task, therefore we should add async right here and await ahead of place. So that's the logic to find the place. Once again, we catch our error and we store it in a constant. Should be equal to new HTTP error. And let's say this is something went wrong. Could not delete place. And error code 500. Let's return next error. All these steps we did before basically. So this is finding the place, the first step. Now we have to delete it from our database, of course. For that, as for saving the data in the end, we again use try catch. And inside our try catch block, we use place.remove this time. So before we had the save method, now we have the remove method. By the way, with all that repetition of the code here, I am aware of the fact that we could refactor the code to save this partially duplicate code. For didactic reasons, I won't refactor the code at this stage so that we can repeat this logic one last time here. So with that, we can remove our place, also an asynchronous task. Therefore, we should add a wait right here to make sure this works correctly. In case of an error, I'll just copy this code up here. Same error code, and we also have to return our next error one last time here. And with that, we are actually done already, because here changing our response doesn't make a lot of sense because we won't get back any document, well, as we remove it. And with that, if we save this now and go back and create one last request here, this time this should be a delete request. And again, the ID of the place that we created right here in our post request, so this ID right here. If we do so, we don't have to add any additional information here. And if I now press send, we get the message deleted place. And if everything worked correctly here, if we go back to our database and reload it, we can see our query results shows 0, so we don't have any more places in our database. And with that, we finished our CRUD operations here, at least for the places. But what is missing at this stage, of course, are our users, because we only worked in our places controller so far, but we actually also got the users controller here. Here we still have our dummy users, so it's time to change that now in the next lectures. So we finished the places for the moment. That's a great first step, but there is more to come. because in addition to places, we also want to add users to our app. Users means that we want to be able to sign up, so to create a new user account. We also want to be able to log in, so to log into this account. And then we want to be able to create a new place for this specific user. And this actually shows the two things that are missing. The first thing is the implementation of this user sign up and login logic. And the second thing is the relation between the users and the places. Because if you think about our application data, then we have these users and these places, and each user has different properties, for example, the name, the email, the password, and the user image. And we have the places with the title, description, the address, the location, and the image. This is what we built already. Once we build the users then, which will be the next step, then we also have to make sure to create a relation between these two entities, you could say. Because in the end, we want to make sure that one user can create multiple places and that one place can only belong to exactly one user. So that's the second important step in the rest of this module, to establish the connection between the users and the places. Therefore, let's now continue with step 1, creating our users logic. Creating the code for the users is pretty straightforward actually, because as for the places, we again need a schema, so what we built right here in our place.js file, where we predefine the structure of a document, so of the data a new user signup has to contain. Then we will export this schema and use it here in our users controllers. So that's actually what we want to do right here. So with that, let's get started with the schema first. And to do this, we again go to our models folder, now create a new file, this time a user.js file, and now we can again follow the logic we learned before. We first have to import Mongoose here, so we require Mongoose. And what else do we have to import? Well, we need our schema constant here with mongoose.schema to be able to create the schema. As I said, now we want to create the user schema, therefore naming our constant user schema makes sense, I guess. We again will instantiate a new JavaScript object here, and this object now contains all the properties our new user needs. So what properties are these? Well, the first property obviously is the user name. As for the places before, we will again use an object here, and the name should be of type string, and it should also be required. So required should be set to true. We can actually copy this because our second property, the email, will kind of have the same information, but I want to add one additional property here. Because our email will be an information which we query a lot. For example, when we do the user login, well, we need to query the user email in our database. Now, although the database in this project, in this course, will not be very big, if you have a really big database, which is typically the case if you store user data, then you want to make sure that your email is queried as fast as possible. And for that, you can simply add unique right here. If you set unique to true, this will just create an index for the email, which in simple words simply speeds up the querying process if you request the email. Therefore, we add this property at this point. Another property we need is our password, of course, for the user. So the user has to add a password. The password should also be a string here, and it should be required. And we could add one additional property, the min length property. This simply validates the minimum length, so the minimum amount of characters our password should have. In our case, we'll stick to 6 characters here. That's optional though, but I guess it makes sense here to at least make sure the user adds a minimum length for the password he uses. The next property is our image. We had this before in our places. This is again a string and required is set to true. Again, we are talking about the URL here, so that's basically the same logic we had before for the places. We don't store any files in our database. The last property we have to add for our user schema is the places property here. Places plural because one user can have multiple places, but one place can only be allocated to one single user. You remember what we talked about in the last lecture. And places will be dynamic later, so we will store the IDs of the places allocated to a user right here. For the moment, I'll just use a string and set required to true. This means we will add the place manually, but that's just step one. Later in this module, when we add the relation between places and users, this will of course be a more dynamic approach where we collect the ID from the corresponding place a user created. With that, we are almost done with our schema and we could already create and export our model, but there is one thing missing here. Because unique up here, as I said, only creates an internal index in the database to make it easier and faster to query our emails. What is missing though at the moment is an internal validation whether the email that we want to create right here exists already. This is not done by unique. For that, we have to use a third-party package, the Mongoose unique validator. And to use it, we first have to install it with npm install --save mongoose unique validator. With that, it's installed, and now we can use it by creating a new constant named unique validator, and now we require the Mongoose unique validator right here. With that, we can use this third-party package to make sure we have a unique email here, and to add it to our schema, we simply add it to the schema via the plugin method here. So we add unique validator, like this. With that, we made sure that we can query our email as fast as possible in our database with unique, and we made sure that we can only create a new user if the email doesn't exist already with our unique validator package here. Now we can create and export our model. We know the syntax already. It's module.exports, and this should be mongoose. Now the model method. And here we have to give our model a name. As I said for the places already, this should be in a singular form and with an upper capital starting character. So in our case, naming the model user makes a lot of sense. As you remember, this will also define the name of our collection. So the collection will be called users without the capital U. And we want to export our user schema here. Let's save this now. And with that, we finished the creation of the schema and the model. Very important though, we still don't have any connection between users and places. I want to repeat that because this will come later. But if we look at both topics separately, we have now the places schema and the user schema. Therefore, let's now use our user model. Let's now use our model. And as for the places where we started with creating a new place, so with creating a document, we have to follow the same approach right here. So first, we should have a look at the create process, creating a new document, meaning we should have a look at the user sign up here, so to create a new user. For that, we go to the users controller and now first import our newly created user model right here. So we use a new constant named user, which is equal to our path. So this is /models/user. Now we can use the user model and we'll work on get users later. But here, our sign-up constant, this is where we have to change some code now. The first code block, so this part right here, is okay. We'll come back to that later though, because we have to adjust a little thing, but this is not important at the moment. But here, our has user constant, the created user, and how we add the new user. These are the areas we have to change now. Let's start with this has user constant here. Here we have some kind of dummy validation already to check whether a user email exists already. With our newly created user model, this whole logic does not apply anymore, so let's change it here. But one important note. As I said before, we have a validation already in here with our unique validator package. The little issue about this package is that we get a default validation. This means we get an error message in case the email exists already, but it might be a very technical error message. So to make sure we have a nicer user experience, we should add a manual validation logic right here. This means we will get rid of this code right here. And now let's say this is our existing user. And this should be equal to user, so our user model, dot. And now, how can we check whether an email exists already? Well, we've defined one method here. Find one simply finds one document matching the criteria in the argument of our method. And what would be the criteria in our case? Well, it would be the user email. So with that, we can easily check if the email of the user exists already. So as with save or find as we had it before, this right here is again what? Well, an asynchronous task, and therefore we of course should wrap this in our try catch code block like this. And this also means we cannot use a constant right here due to block scoping. So we add let existing user right here and get rid of the constant. Additionally, we have to add async up here and await ahead of our user. So this was step one. Now we check whether an email exists already. If checking this doesn't work, so not if we find an email, but just if this find one method does not work as intended, then we want to catch any potential errors and store it in an error constant. For new HTTP error, we did this a lot of time already. As I said, we could refactor the code a bit, but for demonstration purposes, I rewrite this code again. And we could say that signing up failed. Please try again later. Of an error code of 500. And we also have to return next error. So let's now say we find a user emailer already, so the user exists. Well then, if existing user, so if this is true in the end, then I want to create another error, new HTTP error here, and I want to return user exists already. Please log in instead. And the error code here would be 422. And we want to return next error to stop the code execution. One side note here. You can argue whether you want to expose the information right here so that the user exists already. You can also be more cryptic here and say login failed. I think for a better user experience at this point, we should give the user the information that the user is existing already. Let's now finally say we don't have an existing user, so creating a new user is possible. Well, then we are at this code block, and again, as we did it for our places, just to remind you down here in the places, we now have to make sure that we add all the properties we created in our user.js file. So name, email, password, image, and places. Let's do this by, well, maybe getting rid even of these and creating it again from scratch. So let's now say that our created user should be a new instance of this class, of our user model in the end. And this should be the name which the user enters, the email the user enters, and an image. Again, the image should not be the file, but the URL to a file. I got a link to a file from the web here, again for demonstration purposes. It's exactly the same process that we followed when we used our places model. So we have this dummy image. Then the user password right here. This is a user input. Another very important side note here. We will save the plain user password at this stage of the course, but very important, this is not the way to go here. At this point, we don't care, but later in the authentication module of this course, we'll of course encrypt the password here, because storing the not encrypted password is of course a serious security issue, so don't do it this way. This is just the right approach at this stage of the project. And finally, we add our places. As I said, places will be a dummy value for the moment, so just what the user adds as the place ID. Once the relation was set up, this will be a lot more dynamic. With that, we can create a new user actually. What is missing though is how can we now save the user? For that, I'll again delete the dummy user's code here. And well, for saving the data, what do we use? Well, we use again the save method. If we go to the places controller down here, that's actually exactly the code we need right here. And this time I will actually copy paste the code to speed things up a bit at this stage, like this. So we await not the created place, but the created user at this stage. and we catch an error. And if this fails, we will simply say not creating place, but maybe signing up failed. Please try again later, error code 500. So that's the same logic we had before. And here for our response, we'll again also use a well-known approach. So we will convert our Mongoose object, the created user, to a default JavaScript object. And we'll also set getters to true. What's the reason for that? Well, it removes the ID, so the underscore in front of the ID property, to make it easier to access the later ID. Very important here, what we get back as a response also includes the password. As I said, this is also not what you would typically do. It's just here for demonstration purposes at this stage of the project. And here we can actually make small u, not the capital U. So let's now restart our development server and go back to Postman, create a new post request here. Again, HTTP localhost 5000 /API /users this time, not places, and now /sign up to create a new user here. Now we need a body with JSON data once again. And here we have to add all the properties we added in our model. So first we need a name, which could be menu, my name here, an email, test@test.com. We don't need an image. We provided that in the code. So we need to add a password here. Maybe test should be a string. And we add the places as said before with the dummy input here. We'll change it later when we create the relation. So if I now hit send, and as we can see, we have a problem, but we actually have two problems. First, our request doesn't work. And second, we don't have an error message. So let's first check the problem with the error message here. Yeah, I got it. Yep, this is the problem. We are using throw here, but we are now in an asynchronous task. So this doesn't work. We have to use return next here to avoid this error. So let's put this in here. Now this should at least work. And we should also correct this for all our other cases where we have throw as part of an asynchronous task. For example, here in our places controller, I think we got the same problem. Yeah, down here for update place. Here we should also use return next. Oops. Like this. So with that, we also corrected this problem here. Don't think we have any other throw errors. So if we now go back to Postman and send the request, we at least get an error message that we passed invalid inputs. And the reason for that message now is, well, our password. You remember? Here, in our user model, we said that the password should have a minimum length of 6. Well, and our current password doesn't fulfill these requirements as we only have 4 characters in our password. So if we add 2 or 3 characters, let's say it should be testers, and hit send once again, then we are again in another loop. So that's the third problem we have. But what's this problem? Well, as we are using our dummy property for the places here, so this one in our schema, and also here in our model, we of course also have to add it right here to our constant. So if we add places right here, save this, go back to Postman and hit send, you can see we finally created our new user. We have the ID with our getters logic, we got the name, the email, and all our results. Again, we get back the password here. That's not the final implementation we will have. But if we now have a look at MongoDB, we should see that we have our places database. And in the users collection, we can find our newly created user. So with that, we can now create a new user. So the sign up is done. Now it's time to log in our user. So the next step for our users is now to make sure that we can use our login. So this code right here, because we can create a new user, now we want to make sure that once we stored our credentials in a database, we can also log in. One important note though before we start, the password validation is still going to be some dummy code, because at the moment we don't have any token which is sent with the password, so we cannot really validate our data. Therefore, at the moment, we only have a dummy code, so to say, which will simply check whether a user is existing and or if the password he enters is correct. So it's not a real login, we just implement this basic functionality. Just keep that in mind. However, as I said, we have to work on the login here, and the core logic is not that different from the one we saw for our sign up. So to get started, we'll again delete this code right here. And now what I want to do is I first want to start with our custom email validator that we already implemented up here for the sign up logic. So this code right here, we can basically copy paste it because I again want to make sure that the email address of the user is valid. For that, let's go down and let's paste this code right here. Maybe add a space here. One difference though, here not signing up would fail, but logging in would fail, but the general logic is the same. So that's step one, we validated our email. Now let's continue with the actual check whether the user email or the password is correct. This is what I was referring to at the beginning of this video. It's not a real finished validation though, it's just a dummy validation in the end to make sure the email and or the password is stored in a database in case either mail or password is wrong, the user cannot log in. I actually already said what we have to write in the code now. If here and if what? Well, if our existing user, is not stored in the database, or if the existing user password, so we can access the password property here, is not equal to the password that was entered. Well, if one of these is the case, then we again have an error with our HTTP error. And this time we can state invalid credentials could not log you in. Error code here would be 401. And we have to add return next. Again, also nothing new to us. And with that, we are actually done already. We can now validate the email and we can check whether the email and the password are correct. Well, if both is the case, then we should be able to log in now. So let's save this. And I get an error. And why do I get the error? Well, because here find one is an asynchronous task. Therefore, we should make sure to add async also right here. So make sure not to forget this. If I now save, this should work. So let's go back to Postman. And here I'm not in sign in now, but in the login route. And we now only have to add two things, email and password, as we showed it right here. So let's delete this one. And now what is our email? Well, for that, we can go to our database. Here in the users collection, we have the email test@test.com. Let me simply copy paste this one right here. And the corresponding password is here, testers. So if we do this and hit send, we get back logged in. So this seems to work. If I now enter testers1 as a password, I get invalid credentials, so this seems to work. And if I enter test1@test.com, this also doesn't work. Once again, with test@test.com, we get the successful login. So with that, we can now log in. One thing is missing though, and this is up here, our get users constant. We have to work on that as a next step. So what I want to achieve next now is I want to send a request which returns all the users stored in our database. How can we achieve this? Well, by first getting rid of our code right here. We'll also type a new response code so we can delete it for the moment. And in our constant, we use again users and now our find method. Now with find, we can now search the documents stored in the database and then get back the users in theory. But actually, I would like to be a bit more explicit here. I would like to find only the email and the name, so I don't want to return the password of a specific user. As I said, we are not finished with our security and authentication part. This will be covered later, but generally, actually, when we get the users, we should actually return email and name. Now we have different options to do so. By the way, we also used find already here in the places controller, here with get places by user ID. Down here we use find. Here we refer to a specific property. This time I would like to refer to two different properties, namely the email and the name. And we have two options to do this. We will use the concept of projection right here. This works by adding an empty JavaScript object. And now we can either add email and name like this, so this would return the email and the name, or we can simply add a minus sign here and now exclude our password. I'll follow this approach here, both work fine for our purposes. However, storing it as a constant here won't work because, as we know, find is an asynchronous task, therefore let's first add async up here. And now what will we do? Well, we'll again create let users here because we will wrap our code in a try catch block once again. Therefore, we'll add the code right here, get rid of our constant, and add a wait ahead of users. So that's the try block. And now once again, in case this does not work, then we catch the error by storing it in a constant. It's always the same approach in the end. And now return fetching users failed. Please try again later. Error code 500 and return next error. So with that, we can get the users. And if this is successful, then we have to get a response, of course, and our response will again be a JSON response, which will be of users, but now again users.map, because again find returns an array, so we cannot convert this into a default JavaScript object. Therefore, we'll add the map method right here and now say that our user should be turned into a default JavaScript object. Now the syntax is working again. And with that, we can again use set getters to true to get rid of our ID that will be returned. And if we save that, we can now, if we check our routes again, go to /users. As you can see, no need for sign up or login anymore, as we only want to get the users. So we can get rid of login right here. And if we now send a get request without any information in the body, so this is of course not required. If we send it, we get back our user menu right here, so not very spectacular as we only have one user, but it seems to work. Let's now add a second user quickly. So here at our API users sign up route, body, raw, JSON, and let's quickly add the name, which could be Max. We have the email, maybe test2@test.com. We have the password, which could be testers2 here. And we have a place, the places, let's say New York. There should of course be a post request here. If we send this, storing the user seems to be successful. Let's go back to our get request, send it, and now you can see we get back both Manu and Max. This works fine. Let's now also see whether it worked in our database. So let's reload this right here. And as you can see, we got both Max and Manu stored in the database. So getting the users also works fine now. There is one crucial thing missing though. And this crucial thing is of course the relation between our places and our users. At the moment, I'm using some dummy code here for our places in the users.js file, and here for the creator in the place.js file. And we also enter the place manually if we create a new user. So this code down here where we add the places. This should of course be changed now, and that's actually the last crucial step here in this MongoDB module, so let's continue with that. To create a new place and to add it to a user, we have to go to our places controllers now, right here. First, we have to import our user model here, because as we want to interact with the user, well, we kind of have to establish this connection. So let's import the user here. And this is located in /models/user. So with that, we can use our user schema. Now we can go down to our create place constant right here. And this is where we have to change some things. One thing that will change is the data type of the creator field. Previously, it was a simple string. Now, since we'll establish a relation between places and users, it'll be a special type which MongoDB uses to manage IDs. Why is this the case? Because we now store a real MongoDB ID in this field, not any dummy string anymore. But generally, our created place constant is fine. Things change down here though, because instead of immediately saving the place, we have to check whether the user ID we provided exists already, because only we have a user created with the corresponding ID, we should be allowed to create a new place. For that, I'll create a new variable and name it user. And I'll again wrap the following code in a try-catch block. It's again the same logic we had before. So in case we have any general error, we should catch this. Therefore, we can actually get started with the catch block here and store it in a constant again, which is a new HTTP error here, stating that creating place failed. Please try again with a 500 error code, and I'll return next code here. So that's what we did before. So that's just some general error. But now the question is, what do we actually want to do with our user here? Well, user should be equal to user.findById creator. Because what we want to do right here is we want to access the creator property of our users and check whether the ID we have for our login user is already stored in here. So we want to check if the ID of the user is existing. That's the code we have right here. And as we are in an asynchronous task, we have to add a wait right here once again. So we want to check whether the ID of the logged in user is existing already. In case we have a general problem, we catch it right here. But in case our check is successful, so in case we can check the ID of the creators, well, then we just want to make sure that if the user is not existing, so if the user is not in our database, well, then again, we have an error stating that we could not find user for provided ID. Error code should be 404 here. Don't forget to return the error once again to stop our code execution. We could also console log the user here if we want to. That's optional though, but let's maybe add it here in our code. But if this user is existing, well, then we can do two things now. First, we can store or create that new document with our new place. And second, we can add the place ID to the corresponding user. To do this, we have to replace this code here or refactor this code here. The catch block is fine, but here, try, this is what we have to work on. To do that, we need to be able to kind of execute different or multiple operations which are not directly related to each other. And if one of these operations fails, so if either creating the place fails or if storing the ID of the place in our user document, so if one of these operations fails independently from each other, then we want to make sure to undo all operations. So basically to throw this error without changing anything in the document. So that's the important thing. We want to do two things, and only if both things succeed, we want to continue and we want to change our documents. To do that, we need to use transactions and sessions. The transaction simply does what I just said. The transaction allows you to perform multiple operations in isolation of each other and to undo these. And the transactions are basically built on so-called sessions. So to work with these transactions, we first have to start a session, then we can initiate the transaction, and once the transaction is successful, the session is finished and the transactions are committed. So with that, our place is created and the place ID is stored in our users document. Sounds a bit complicated again. Let's do it step by step now, and you'll see it's actually a quite straightforward process. What we first need is a new constant. Let's call it sesh maybe. This is basically our current session that starts when we want to create this new place. For that, we have to add await again. We are still in an asynchronous task here, and we have to refer to the start session method Mongoose provides. As I said, with the session here, we can now also start our transaction. So in our current session, we want to start the transaction, another method we can use here. And with that, we can now tell Mongoose what we want to do here. What we want to do here is we want to make sure that our created place should be saved, right? We want to save it in the database. And as an argument, we have to provide the session property and refer to our current session, so the session that is currently running. With that, we will create a new place and automatically create the unique ID for our place here. And saving, we learned that already, is of course an asynchronous task. Therefore, make sure to add await here. So this was part one. Now we stored the place. And now, with the place being created, we need to make sure that the place ID is also added to our user. For that, we can refer to our user here and now say user.places, right? We want to access our places property. And here we want to push, so to add basically the created place. Push here is not the standard push, which you can use on any JavaScript array, by the way. Instead, this is a method used by Mongoose, which kind of allows Mongoose to, behind the scene, establish the connection between the two models we are referring to here, so to say. Very important here, behind the scenes, MongoDB grabs the created place ID, that's an integrated Mongoose feature here, and adds it to the places field of the user. So it only adds the places ID. That's important at this stage. With that, we stored the place, we added the places ID to our user. What's missing now is, of course, another asynchronous task. We have to save our updated user now. And again, this updated user should again be part of our current session that we are referring to. And only once all these tasks are successful, so we could create the place, we could add the place ID, and we could save the user, well then, we want to make sure that the session commits the transaction right here. Another asynchronous task, so don't forget to add await. And just to make this clear here, only at this point the changes are really saved in the database. If anything would have gone wrong in the tasks that are part of this session and transaction, all changes would have been rolled back automatically by MongoDB. And that's it actually. With that, we use the session and the transaction for all these tasks, and only if this is successful, then the place will be created and the user will be updated. And just to give you some examples when this error code could occur, either our database server is down or something related to that, or the database validation fails. So these are two cases when things could go wrong here. The response can't stay the way it is. There is one important thing we have to know though, because so far when we created a new user or a new place and we didn't have a collection, the collection was created automatically in MongoDB. For the transaction, this is different. Here, if we don't have an existing collection, so in our case, we want to create a new place. This means we have to create a places collection. You remember here, place.js, we have place. This means places without the capital P would be our collection name. So we have to create this collection manually now. Because if you go to our MongoDB database, you see we have the places database, that's the database name, but this database only contains one collection. Therefore, we have to hit the plus right here and now add the collection name places like this and press create. This makes sure our transaction is successful. As I said, this is only required if we don't have the collection created already. With that, let's go back to our code and make sure we save our places controllers, our place.js and our user.js file. And of course that our development server is running. And if we now go to our database, to users, here we can now first delete our two existing users. Here and right there. To start this whole thing from scratch. Now let's go to Postman. Create a new post request here, /users/signup. To create a new user, we need the body, raw data, and JSON. And now we need to provide our name. Let's say menu here. Then we have to provide our email, which could be test@test.com. And we need to provide our user password for the newly generated user here. Let's use testers again. With that, if we now hit send, we should see that the user is created. We see we have an empty array for the places as this new user doesn't have any places at the moment. And we see the ID right here. And if we now go back to our database and reload, we can also see that the user was created right there, also with the object ID here. Let's copy this ID because now we will create a new place. And here, as I said before, we have to copy and paste this user ID to allocate this place to a specific user. This will be changed in the authentication part. I repeat that, don't forget about that. It's just a dummy solution at this stage of the project. So back in Postman, we have to create another request, another post request to localhost 5000, but this time not users, but simply places. We need again the body and the raw and the JSON format here. And now, which properties do we need? We need the title again. And let's stick to the Empire State Building here. We need a description. Again, a very famous building. We need the address. I'll add it in a few seconds. Let me first copy paste our creator ID here. This one, so that's the ID of the user we just created. And now let me quickly grab the address of the Empire State Building. I'm again using Google Maps for that. Here we go. Creator, by the way, so missing the A here. Now the properties look fine. With that, if we hit send now, we get back an error, and I think I know why, to be honest. Because, well, we are using Mongoose here, right? And up here, we didn't import it to our file. Well, this can of course not work, so let's quickly add Mongoose here. Save this, and if we now go back to Postman and again hit send, I think this should work. Yeah, this looks good. Now we created this new place, so this is the place ID, and down here we also get back our creator ID. And if we now have a look at MongoDB once again, in our places collection, we can also see that the place was created successfully, also with the place ID and the creator ID. And if you now remember that A5 at the end, that's the ID of the place. And if we check now our users, we see we have the array right here. And if we click onto this array, you can see A5 at the end. This is the ID of our place. So this seems to work fine. Let's now see what happens if we enter a wrong user ID. For that, we can just change the 7 here to a 6, for example. And if we hit send, we get back, could not find user for provided ID. So this works fine. This means we can only create a new place now if the user ID is existing. And this was exactly the goal of this operation here. What is missing now though is of course the option to also delete a place. And if we delete the place, we kind of have the similar logic. So we want to delete the actual place and we want to delete the ID of this place in the document of the corresponding user. Let's implement this as a next step. So back in our code, let's now go down to our delete place constant and see what we have to change here to make sure we can delete the place successfully. The first part here, our try catch block to check whether we have any general error, is fine. There is only one thing we have to add right here. Because what we want to do in the end is we want to find the place ID of a place we're looking for to delete this place. But at the same time, we also want to search through our users collection and see which user has this place. And then we want to make sure that if we delete a place, that this ID is also deleted from this user document. This means we need access to a user document and we need to overwrite or change an existing, information in this document. And to do so, we can use the so-called populate method here. Populate allows us to exactly do that, so to refer to a document stored in another collection and to work with data in that existing document of that other collection. To do so, we need a relation between these two documents, and these relations were established in our user.js file, here with ref place, and in our place.js file, here with ref user. Only if this connection is existing, then we are allowed to use populate. Otherwise, this populate method would not work. And the populate method needs one additional information. It needs information about the document where we want to change something. And within this document, we need to refer to a specific property. In our case, this is the creator property, because the creator property contains the user ID. Mongoose then takes this ID, but searches through the entire user data. So the ID allows us to search through the user and then to get back all the data stored in a user document. With that, we have the theoretical option to change something in our user, and of course to also find a place by ID in our place document. We can keep the rest of this code here like this is fine. Now, before we work on this try catch block though, I see we missed something before, because what we should do here actually is, before we continue, we should check whether a place is actually existing, because this is our general error catching part, but we never check whether a place ID actually exists. Let's quickly implement that. If place like this, so if we don't find a place for the provided ID, well then we want to return an error stating that we could not find place for this ID, error code 404, and of course return next error like this. So this is what we forgot before. Now this is a better error handling syntax, I would say. So let's now focus on to this try catch part though, because actually this is exactly the same approach that we followed when creating the place. Of course, now we don't want to save and push, but well, remove and pull, little hint here. But generally, the handling of this code is exactly the same. So we again need a session to start our transaction, and only if we can delete the place and if we can delete the place ID from the corresponding user, then this transaction should be executed. Otherwise, we will have an error here. So this one, something went wrong, could not delete place. So now is your chance to pause the video at this stage and to implement this code on your own. After that, we'll do it together. So let's see. We already have some code here. I would like to start from scratch though. For that, we first need to create our new constant for our current session. Here we have to add await as it's an asynchronous task. And now we need to use start session here. With start session, we can now use the start transaction method here. And with that, we can get started with the actual logic we need to make sure we can delete the place. First, we need to remove the place from our places collection. We checked before whether the place exists. Therefore, we can simply refer to place remove here. And we need to add the session property here to make sure we refer to the current session, so ses here. So this is the session that we just created. And removing also is an asynchronous task. So we remove the place. Now we have to access our place stored in the creator, so the place ID. For that, we refer to place.creator, and in the creator, we want to access places, so our places array. And here, we now don't want to push, but to pull, well, what? Our place. As explained before for push, pull will also automatically remove the ID. So we don't have to explicitly tell Mongoose to remove an ID. This is done internally by default. This should hopefully remove the place from the user. What we need to do now is we need to save our newly created user. This is again an asynchronous task. And we refer to place.creator and now to the save method. Very important though, as we did it for remove with our places, here we again have to refer to our current session. You can name this of course as you prefer. This is the name of the constant here. We can use places pull and save on creator like that because creator, well, thanks to populate, gave us the full user object linked to that place. And if all this was successful, then we can finally commit our transaction So this is it actually. With that, we can now also hopefully remove a place. The response right here is fine, so we can keep this. So let's save this and let's go to MongoDB. And let's say we want to delete the Empire State Building now. For that, we need our object ID here. So this one. So let's copy paste this. Now let's go to Postman, create a new request. This time, this is a delete request. This goes to /places here. And now our ID that we just copied. If we hit send now, we can hopefully delete the place, and we should also see that the place is no longer part of the array in our user. So let's hit send. And this looks good. We get the message deleted place here. Let's also have a look at this in our database. If we reload that, we can see places is empty, so this worked fine. And also for our user here, we still have the array, but as you can see, we don't have any more places here in our array. Therefore, deleting the place from the user also worked fine. With that, we are almost done with this module. There is actually one optional thing I would like to show you, because here we use this populate method. And there is another part in our project where we could use this populate method. This is optional though. I just want to show you how this method works in a bit more detail. And the place where we can use this as an alternative is here when we get our places by the user ID. So in this constant here, this is the last part of this module in the end. So let me show you how we can use an alternative syntax here with the populate method. So how can we change the logic of our get places by users ID constant here? As I said, this is a totally optional approach. Therefore, we don't have to do this here, but for demonstration purposes, I want to show you this. Now keep in mind that here, down there in our delete place constant, we used populate to get access to the entire content of a document stored in a different collection. We use the creator property here, but with the creator property, which contains the ID, Mongoose can simply access the entire content of this document stored in the other collection. And with that, we can then interact with this document. As we saw it here, we were able to change, for example, the places property. So that's the idea. You get access to the entire content of another document stored in a different collection. Now, and with get places by user ID, it's the same logic. Here we are searching the place for a specific user ID. So the user ID we are providing because we want to get back the places a specific user has stored. But to display all places a user has, we can also use this populate syntax. For that, let me maybe comment this out here as I want to rename this variable. Let's name it maybe user with places like this. And now here we say that user with places is equal not to place.find, but to, well, user.find by ID, right? Because here I want to look for a specific what? For a specific user ID. So the user ID that we send as part of our get request. So up here, ID, not with a capital D here though. So this is the part where we search for a specific user ID. And with populate, we can now get access to the corresponding places a user has. And for that, we only have to access the places property as part of our populate method here. And that's it actually. We can now search for a specific user ID and check the corresponding places. Our error message right here is still fine, so we can leave this one. Down here, we have to change our variable name now though. So we say whether we cannot find a user with places or whether not places.length, but user with places dot places length. So this is also correct here. The last adjustment we have to make is down here in our response. Here we now also don't use places.map, but we want to access the user with places.places. And with that, if we save this, we can now quickly go to our database again and reload it. And here the thing is, as we deleted all our places before, we should create a new place maybe. For that, I'll grab our user ID here and now go to Postman. So let's now quickly create a new place here, a post request to our well-known route in the meanwhile. So /API/places, go to the body, raw, JSON, and here we can now again enter the data. Title would be the Empire State Building, maybe one last time. Description, a very nice building. The address will be added soon. I just want to copy paste the creator ID first here in our creator. So this one, and now the address again from Google Maps here. Let's now see if this works by hitting send. Yeah, this looks good. The place was created. Let's now add a second place to show you that this also works with multiple places. So maybe the Madison Square Garden. Awesome for great events. And also quickly the address here. So let's also create this place. Looks fine. And now we need to create a GET request because now I want to see whether I can get the places. So /API/places, but here it's now /user, and now we have to enter our user ID. Let's copy that again, paste it, and now send the GET request. And as you can see, now we get all the places which are part of our user by using the populate method. And just to show you that this works, if I would change 7 to 8 here, then we should get an error. Yeah, we could not find places for the provided ID. With 7, this is working. And if I go back to our database and reload it, you can of course also see that we have our user and now these two places in the database. And that's it actually. With that, we implemented a lot of core logic in this MongoDB and Mongoose module. Before we summarize what we learned, let's quickly have a look at our code and see if we can clean it up a bit. Throughout this module, we learned a lot about how to work with databases from our Node.js Express backend. We started in the place.js file here. Here we defined our schema and the corresponding model, which we then used in the places controller. Here we were able to perform all CRUD operations, so create, read, update, and delete, referring to our places here. We then applied our knowledge also for the user.js file. Here we again created a schema and a corresponding model, and then we're able to create new users or to get the existing users in here in our users controllers.js file. What was missing though was the connection between these two parts, so between the places and the users. This is what we finally added in this module. We learned that we can connect different models and schemas with the ref property right here. And this allowed us to create places and to make sure that when we create a new place, the ID of this place is also added to the corresponding creator. At the same time, we have the creator ID stored in the place. And we also made sure that if we delete a place, that this place, so the corresponding ID of this place to be more precise, is also removed from our creator. As part of this, we learned awesome methods like down here, our populate method, which makes it very easy to get access to documents stored in different collections in MongoDB. So this is it. This was the database part of this course. I hope you enjoyed it. And now we can continue with the next part, and this will be connecting the front end and the back end.